MO. It is May, and it is Horror Mayhem. So this month I've been reading short horror books. Horror Mayhem is all about reading horror books 250 pages or less, but just generally it's about reading horror books. And I'm fairly new to the horror genre. Now, there are some books, some of my all-time favorite books that are actually horror books, but I think I read them more as like sci-fi, and I think I didn't really hone in on the horror aspects as much until I started booktube, until I started learning more about the horror genre and following more horror-loving booktubers. Something that I started thinking about when I did start reading more horror is what kind of horror I like, obviously, and that's something I'm going to be exploring all year. What kind of this genre do I like? What kind of that genre do I like? I definitely plan on doing a favorite book audit and talking about that at some point in the future, but while it's Horror Mayhem, I thought now would be a good time to explore that horror genre. What do I like in horror? What different aspects of horror are there? There's so many subgenres and categories of horror that it's almost impossible to list them all, to name them all. This is something that I've been thinking about for a while and something that I've been thinking about doing a video on, but I never really could collect and organize all the different horror that I felt there were. But I recently watched a video by Riley Marie. I really love her channel. I will list that video down below. It was just a video where she read 3 horror books, but it was really interesting. She said something about horror that made me think about doing this video again and inspired this video, and also kind of made me feel more organized about how I could think about horror. Riley Marie said that, and this is kind of just like an aside thing that she said when she was talking about the books that she was reading. She said that there are 3 types of horror, that there are 3 levels of horror, that there's scary things that can't happen, so that's aliens, paranormal, magic, supernatural, monsters. The next category would be real things that could happen but under a very specific set of circumstances. So those are scary things like underwater. Like, you would have to be an underwater scientist to spend a lot of time in a submarine. You would have to be an astronaut to go into space. So those are things that, yes, are possible things that are scary. Vastness, obviously all these categories kind of flow together, possibly supernatural or paranormal things that could happen like because you're somewhere unknown. So there might be scary things lurking in the deep of the ocean. There might be scary things lurking out in space, but it's very unlikely that you would be in that situation. And so I think that a lot of different horror fits into that too, like even some like mystery horror or those kind of mystery tropes of being like in an isolated place. Like, how often are you really going to get a mysterious letter that leads you to an isolated island? Probably not that often. And if you did, you might think twice about taking that free trip or that surprise inheritance. And then the third category that Riley Marie talked about was things that are very common that could happen at any time. And to me, those meant very realistic, real-life horrors. Riley Marie said home invasion. She said stalkers. The book The Hole comes to mind, which is a Korean horror. So it's being in a car accident and then being beholden to someone who you don't know is maybe not the best for you at first. So real-life horrors that involve people. So things like SA, someone fixating on you and going berserk and murdering you. Home invasion is definitely one of those things. And those are much more like realistic horrors, and Riley Marie was saying that those are the things that are the scariest to her, and I think I'm definitely inclined to agree. Moving on from that idea that there are those 3 categories, those 3 levels of horror, then that leads me to think about how many books that have those third category, that real life horror that could happen to you, in it are not even horror books. Some of the books that have scarred me the most, some of the books that I still have nightmares about, are not horror books. They're just contemporary books. They're literary fiction books. Maybe they're something in another genre or genre fiction, but that has something so scary like that in it. So I think SA, I think kidnapping, I think home invasion, all those things can absolutely be terrifying, but not necessarily found in horror books. I think Criminale would categorize those books as disturbing books. He's doing a disturbing book project, which is really interesting, where he's reading the most disturbing books that he can. That is not a project that I would ever take on, but the idea of categorizing books that are super disturbing, that might have super disturbing aspects in one genre or one category, is an interesting idea, because that means you can add in those real life horrors that are not necessarily found in horror books, as well as books that are classified as horror. That also gets me thinking about all the different paths that horror can take that would fit into those three categories. You have sci-fi, you have climate fiction, you have body horror or gross horror. Sometimes that could be in the third category, real life, but it could also be monster horror. You have psychological horror. The list goes on and on. You could subdivide that into smaller and smaller categories, smaller and smaller avenues of horror. You know, monster horror could be big scary monsters, or they could be vampires, which can be very scary, but a lot of times are not. A lot of people also talk about the idea with horror of horror being for the reader or horror being for the character. So some horror books you can read and you know are terrifying for the characters in the book. You know that if you were in those situations, you'd be scared, but you as the reader are removed enough from them that it doesn't really bother you or affect you. And some horror is so visceral, so ingrained in your own imagination, and I'm sure a lot of this has to do with what freaks us out as individuals, that you are horrified, you are scared for the people in the book, and you're scared yourself. Like, you don't want to go to bed at night, you are nervous. So what kind of horror do I like? I made a list of horror books that I've read. Not all of these fit into the horror mayhem category for sure. Many of these are much longer than 250 pages, and I also didn't count any horror that I read in May for horror mayhem in this list, because I do need a little time to sit with horror, I think. Obviously, some books affect me very deeply, both those that are horrific in the horror category and those that are horrific outside. I would even say that literary fiction horror or general fiction horror is scarier to me. Those realistic horrors are often the ones that impact me the most in a horrifying manner. I do think that when I'm thinking about horror books in the genre, it often takes me a little bit more time to see how I feel about them. So this list definitely contains some of my all-time favorite books, and some of them I would say are horrible, horrific, and some are not. I'm going to start with 3 short novellas that I don't own physically. Come Closer by Sarah Gran is a really interesting horror about possession, and I don't know exactly which category this fits into. I think it probably fits into Riley's third category, things that are scary but are common and could happen, because what's terrifying about Come Closer is the idea that you're losing your mind, the idea that you can't trust your own thoughts and your own sight and your own touch, and you don't know what's happening to you. I think books about losing time and books about your changing perspective can be very scary. I really, really enjoyed Come Closer, but it was one of those books that I felt removed from the character. It was fascinating to listen to her story, and I was scared for her, but I myself wasn't terrified. Last year I read Yellow Jessamine by Caitlin Starling. This I would qualify more as like a monster horror, something that couldn't happen. So it might be scary, there might be scary elements, but it's more about a entity or a vibe or a sickness or an illness than it is about something that you are worried about in the real world. I did enjoy this one, but I also didn't really find it scary. Another short story that I really love that's horror is The Night Cyclist by Stephen Graham Jones. This is a monster horror, and this one I felt was closer to the third category, something that could actually happen even though it's a monster book, because this is about a restaurant worker, so of course I already identify, and they are cycling home when they encounter someone who is being attacked. So the horror comes from not the supernatural creature necessarily, but real life people and fear and anger and hate. Two books that I didn't pull off my shelf but are kind of similar and are sort of cli-fi books are A Children's Bible by Lydia Millett and Leave the World Behind by Ruben Alam. These both have a creeping dread horror, and I think that these very much are the third category, something that could happen to you, because they're both about a group of people who come together under seemingly innocuous circumstance, and then something happens out in the world. They don't know what it is. You as the reader don't know what it is. And because you are all in the dark about this, there's a real terrifying, creeping dread. And I think that very much if you're worried about the stability of our nation and of the world and of what could possibly happen, if you're scared of war or catastrophe or even just rise in hate and violence, then this is a very real and visceral horror. I think both these books, you aren't very scared as the reader, but if you project yourself into this situation, it is a horrifying situation. I think now we can talk about monsters. Some monster books that I have read are Salem's Lot, which is about vampires. This is the only Stephen King book that I've ever read. And similarly, there is Interview with a Vampire. This is one of my favorite books. I would say probably in my top 20 of favorite books. I've reread this many times and I really enjoy it. Frankenstein, which I read for the first time last year, I really loved that one as well. Dracula, of course, although that is a very campy horror. Those are all monster things that definitely fall into the first category. They're very rare. You're not going to necessarily run into them. So the horror in those books only come from like what you're scared of. If you are scared of the idea of immortality, if you are scared of the idea of being burdened with humanity, if you are scared of the idea of disregard for human life, all those things can be very scary in those books, but none of them I found to be personally like scary to me, but I definitely enjoyed a lot of them. And vampires are one of my all-time favorite book, movie, etc. tropes, one of my favorite kinds of characters. Everything I just said, I love the idea of. I love the idea of disregard for human life. I love the idea of losing your humanity or potentially retaining your humanity when you are a monster. I love the idea of immortality. So all those questions are super interesting to me, but not scary necessarily. One of my all-time favorite books falls into that category as well, and that is The Island of Dr. Moreau. I love this sci-fi horror. It's definitely in my top 5 favorite books of all time. I think what's the most scary about this is not necessarily the creatures that are involved, but the lack of care of humanity, the lack of regard for human life, for animal life, for respect that you give to other creatures that is involved in this. And so I find this to be not necessarily a terrifying horror, but there are some heart-pumping, thrilling, scary moments in this book. And I think similarly, a new favorite book of mine is The Only Good Indians by Stephen Graham Jones. This has a lot of the same themes, but definitely leaning more towards that disrespect of animal life, of the balance of nature, and has to do with our own selfishness and how that can be horrific. So definitely some very scary moments in this. There were definitely moments, again, tense, scary, heart-pounding moments in this book that I was nervous about. Another book that I don't even think I have a copy of this book, but one that I found to be very heart-pounding, scary, disturbing is Coraline by Neil Gaiman. This is a young adult or middle grade book, but this book scared me so much that I remember the first and only time that I've read it, I ended up staying up super late because I had to stay up until I finished the book because it was such a creepy, dread-filled, exhilarating book that it was really scary. And I think one of the things that makes Coraline so scary is the idea idea of people changing and you not realizing it, or people not being who you think they are. And that, to me, falls in the third of Riley's categories, a very real possible event, that all of a sudden you wake up and things are different, people are different, and you don't know what to expect from them. So something kind of in the middle is horror about serial killers, horror about murders. This could definitely fall in Riley's second category, something that you need very specific circumstances to have happen to you. It's highly unlikely that you're going to be murdered by a serial killer. It's highly unlikely that you are going to be wrapped up in some elaborate scheme or anything like that. But does it happen sometimes? Sure. And I think books like Silence of the Lambs and Red Dragon, which are two horror books that I've read by Thomas Harris, fall into that category. They're definitely scary, gory, and gross, and creepy, and disturbing. A book that defies that genre, that falls into the second and third category, is Something Is Always Happening Somewhere by Kelly McClure. This book still gives me nightmares. It totally freaks me out, and I think the reason that it does work so well is it is a specific set of circumstances, but it is a specific set of circumstances that could happen to anyone at any time, because it is completely random. So it's not necessarily a serial killer, it's not necessarily just a home invasion, but it's the circumstance of that combined with the depression and madness that might ensue once you have experienced that. I also think this book really dwells on like predators and how people prey on people, how people become obsessed with people. So I guess it really falls mostly in the Riley's third category, but super gory, super gross, slow in some ways, but that building, creeping, terrible dread slowness, and then the most sad, horrible ending of a book I've probably ever read. Definitely, if you're a horror fan, I would suggest this one, but know that it is not your typical horror. And the last book that I want to talk about that definitely fits into the first category is The Murders of Molly Southbourne by Tade Thompson. This is a clone, creepy horror, but it has aspects of the last category where our main character Molly is taught by her parents to be a fighter, a warrior, to be super careful, to never bleed. And so the idea of being trapped with these people, to be in the unknown, to not know why these people who are there to protect you are training and teaching you for an eventuality that you don't understand is very scary. But then there's like also clones and scary things in this book. This book didn't scare me, but it blew my mind. There was a part in this book that I think about all the time, and it was so creepy. There's definitely body horror in this book, but I loved it. My favorite horrors: The Murders of Molly Southbourne, The Island of Dr Moreau, and The Only Good Indians. These are all shocking, scary, horrifying books, heart-pounding books, but not necessarily fast-paced books in every respect. So what does that say about the horror I like? I'm not really sure what the conclusion of this video is. I've definitely isolated 3 of my top favorite horrors, but what does that say about my horror reading overall? I think the conclusion is that I need to read more horror to really hone in on what kind of horror I love. What is your favorite type of horror? Do you agree with Riley's 3 levels of horror? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks so much for joining me today, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!